Greets peeps, this is Tony the Hero of Flanders, looking to show you through some more of Europa Universalis 4. When last we spoke, we were talking about religion. Now let's talk about the military. So, military in this game is broken into 3 parts, which have 4 components, I guess. I think that's reasonable to say. Okay, so the 3 unit types that you can have are... okay, I can't show them at the moment. 3 unit types you can have are... Can't show them at the moment. 3 unit types you can have are... Okay, so first unit type you can have is infantry. Different types of units are selectable as you go through. We'll have a look at that when that happens. The next selection that we get in unit type, at the moment we're stuck with halberd and... Oh no, sorry, that's not true. So we can choose between Latin medieval infantry and halberd infantry. They have different configurations. They'll always have the same amount of dots, of pips, these are termed by someone somewhere. So they'll always have the same unit of the same number of pips, but they'll be configured in different ways. So where Latin medieval infantry have very good morale, the halberd infantry have good offensive shock and good offensive morale, but no defensive shock or morale, and they have no firepower whatsoever. So the battle goes through 4 different stages. Each army goes through a defensive shock, then defensive fire, then offensive shock, then offensive fire. I believe that's right. We'll have to examine it when we come to our first battle. But the pips add to the likelihood of the unit performing well in that phase of the battle. So as you can see here, during the shock phase, the offensive shock phase, halberd infantry will have a chance to do well. However, they won't do well in the defensive shock phase, and their morale will be weakened during the defensive during defensive actions. Their morale will generally be weaker. That's hard to explain. Now, the unit's morale is determined by the number of pips in here, the number of pips in this column. So during combat, the only unit that will get any advantage over its core unit strength, out of the 2 options available, is the halberd infantry will get a shock bonus during the offensive phase. That is okay. What I'd prefer, because I anticipate being in a defensive war first, before doing anything, I expect France to come knocking. I think we'll need to... I think going for a higher morale type unit, where we can fight defensively, hopefully hold safe ground on... Actually, we have no safe ground. We hide out in the woods where we get a defensive advantage. We'll discuss combat properly when we're involved in it, and hope to see them off. So I think halberd infantry isn't the right pick for us at the moment. I think that... I'm just checking. Yep. I think that Latin medieval infantry will be better for us. Now, because I made that change, all of our units' morale has dropped right down. Sorry, in fact, all of the the morale of all of the infantry has dropped right down because they're completely refitting. They've got a whole lot of work to do. They won't be ready to fight for a long time. Remember this when you get upgrades of unit types. So if we hit level 5 and we decided to change our unit and we were in the middle of a war, their morale would drop to the floor like it has, drop to 0, and they could very easily be routed. We'll talk about battle more later on when we're involved in it, but for now we'll check the Latin Knights, make sure they're the type that we want. Again, we want those morale pips. We're going to be fighting a defensive war. It makes more sense for us to find somewhere safe and hide out, so we'll go with the Latin Knights. That was what was already selected, so their morale doesn't drop through the floor. Cannons don't appear in the game until someone reaches military tech 7. At the moment everyone in Europe is at military tech 3, so we've got a long time before cannons arrive. When they do, they have a profound effect. They change the siege warfare a lot. When we've got level 2 forts, you can expect to see sieges take, they always take months, but before you get cannons they can take literally years. You will have guys besieging a camp for years. It takes a super long time, or it costs a lot of manpower to beat them. It's a tough old game early on. Cannons arrive and forts instantly start getting hammered. If you can get a tech advantage early and use your cannons against your enemy's weaker forts, you're going to have a good time. If you can get a military tech advantage and get good forts before your enemies tech up their cannons, you're going to have a good time. Military tech is a super important tech to focus on, and for that reason I usually avoid spending my military tech ever. This time I made a massive blunder, spent it on a thing that didn't work, and then gave it away anyway. It couldn't have been worse, but this is perfect. This is exactly what you guys need to see, what you shouldn't be doing. So also in this area we can see our naval units. Naval units, I don't really use them. I mean, I definitely will use them. I have ambitions on England. I have ambitions over the seas. So we will use them at some point, but we'll explain them later. They're pretty simple. The combat is dumb and makes no sense. And I mean, it makes perfect sense, but I don't know. I don't understand it. I just try and have way more. In fact, in both land warfare and sea warfare, I just run with the premise of the more the better, and that's a pretty safe option to choose. There's a bit more nuance to it in land battles, and we'll go into those. Sea battles don't seem to have that same nuance. They just seem to be run at each other and shoot until someone gives up. It's kind of strange. Other important things in here are military tactics. Tactics are super huge. Reduces the amount of damage they take. The higher it is, the better. This is our army tradition. So this, as you can see, has various effects, but the most important effect for me is in creating a new general. When you create a new general, actually our leader is an incredibly good, our king is an incredibly good general. But when you have your king in when you have a king or a general attached to a unit, it vastly increases their likelihood that they'll die. I know, I'm not certain that's true for generals. I'm fairly certain it's true for kings. So I almost never assign a king to an army group unless I want him dead, and this guy being a 555, we'll never see a ruler as good as him again, so I definitely don't want him to do any warring, because him dying is just a pain. There's actually some scripted events for Burgundy that could cause us real trouble too if he dies. So I won't spoil the surprise because it may just happen. So we'll see what happens. But military tradition, we want it to keep growing. Each year it grows by... Okay. It's growing each year? That's different. By fully maintained forts, it's growing. Okay, because usually army tradition decays rather than growing. I don't know. I might be reading this wrong. I'm sure I'm reading this wrong. We'll keep an eye on it. We're 15.0 at the moment, so let's keep an eye on it, and we'll investigate again when we next get a general. We're keeping our forts fully maintained. Remember, I turned off the forts there. The reason I was umming and ahhing about it is because not having fully maintained forts increases the amount your army tradition decreases, and we don't want that. We want to keep our army tradition as high as possible because it gives us army morale bonuses, it gives us manpower recovery speed bonuses, gives army morale speed increased bonuses, and it increases our siege ability. But most importantly, it's every 20 points, I think it's every 20 points of army tradition, you get an extra pip to your general. You get an extra dot randomed somewhere into your general. General randomization is a real prick. Sometimes it's amazing, sometimes it's awful, but most of the time it's awful. But having your army tradition high makes you certain that you'll get some pips somewhere along the various options of your general. So keep it high. It's awesome. Army morale is a super good thing to have. We've got a good bonus to our army morale at the moment. We've got 3.07. If we have a look at Burgundy, we need to be at war with them to see their morale bonuses or negatives, but that's quite good morale for this early on. We can tell by those two bonuses that we have. We've got plus 20%, plus 23.7%, but that's reduced. So plus 23% morale bonus on 3. So other nations might be running at around 2.7, 2.8. We've got 3.07. That's cool. We've got a good chance of beating them in a fair fight. It's particularly if we do it correctly. But we'll talk about that later. Land force limit is we have a base land force limit of 6. We have a vassal who contributes to our land force limit. Marriage partners marriage unions don't count towards this. It's only normal full vassals like we have in Nevers. And we have 6 provinces, so they add 8.2. I don't know exactly how that's calculated. I'm sure someone far smarter than I does. But the general premise is the more land you have, the more states you have, the more army you have. In fact, I think it includes territories as well. If you remember, the difference between territories are the ones that land that you've cored, but it isn't a state. You haven't added it to a state. I think they add to the total as well. Navy, I don't care. It's all a bunch of garbage. Not interested. No, I'm really not. So military tactics. We got 0.5 from our current military tactics bonus is 0.5, which is just the base. But if we go back to techs, we can see that all of these things most of these things are reflected in here. We can see that at level 4 we get an extra 0.25. At level 6 we get an extra 0.25. Level 7 we get an extra 0.25. So if we were to jump up 4 techs, we would have double the tactics advantage of any of our neighbors. And that would be amazing. We would be super tough and way more likely to just trash their units. That's not going to happen because that's not the way the game works, and I'm thankful it is, because that would suck to be able to be that powerful and get curb stomped. But in short, the higher it is, the better. Quite right. Discipline. Discipline. So we've got morale, which is, you can think of like strength points of hit points. The discipline is how likely they are to do. I think it's to do damage. What does that say there? Damage done is multiplied by your discipline. There we go. And damage taken is reduced by discipline. Right. So if you have a good discipline bonus, which is great to have, then the damage done to you is reduced, the damage you do is increased, and the less damage you take, the less likely your morale is to be affected and your troops are to be killed in the battle. So discipline, the higher the better. Do it. Any way you can get it. It's great. Morale, similarly, but discipline has a bigger effect. You're more likely to win wars with high prestige. You're more likely to win an even battle with either morale or discipline, but you'll take less damage with more discipline. So I kind of prefer discipline for that reason. It's a weird thing. The bonuses aren't multiplicative. So for discipline or for morale, which I thought they were until recently. So it makes sense if you have good morale already. It makes sense to bump your discipline. If you have good discipline already, it makes sense to bump your morale. If you see what I mean, it's nice to be strong in both veins because they're not multiplying on each other, which I thought they were. A lot of confusing maths in there for this fella. But for me, I think it makes, if you could choose plus 5% morale or 5% discipline, choose discipline, because 5% morale is only affects one area of combat, whereas discipline affects 2. Yeah, that's a good enough. That's the best wording I can give it. Fort defense impacts how long. Okay, so the higher our defensiveness is, the longer it takes for the siege cycle to occur. We'll talk about that when that happens, but better defense is good. Cavalry to infantry ratio, that's all well and good, but I don't like having more anywhere near that amount of cavalry. They, as we saw when we were looking at them, they do more damage, but they also cost more than twice the amount of infantry, and they also take more than twice the amount of, more than three times, I think, the amount of maintenance per month. They're, with a few exceptions where they're specially built, I don't like having that much cavalry. Combat width. Combat width is a super important thing. It can be reduced. There we go. So your combat width is reduced by things like fighting in hills, fighting in highlands, fighting in mountains. But when you're on an open plain, you want to be able to flank the enemy. If you have as wide a army as you can, you're going to flank them, and your cavalry will be able to harass their flanks. The cavalry always go, we'll have to discuss this later, but being at maximum combat width is a good idea in most cases. Where you will come a cropper is if we tried to go maximum combat width at the moment, we'd first of all go over our maximum number of troops allowed and pay massively for the troops who were over the top of our limit. We'd go bankrupt. It's really vicious, the amount that you're charged for going over the limit of your army. Not so of the Navy, strangely. I'll regularly go over on my Navy. But with the army going over the top of that to just maximize my combat width wouldn't be worth it. It also wouldn't be worth it because, excuse me, this is going to be loud. Wow, that was a good one. So, because we're early on in the game, combat supplies are a real concern. Well, they remain a concern throughout the game. So when we have selected a unit and we hover over, we can see that we've got a supply limit of 23 there. That's all well and dandy. That's a nice piece of farmland. Let's have a look up here in the hills where the supply limit is 11. If we were to walk our army through that through this area, we would start taking attrition. Attrition is this nasty little guy here, whereby you lose troops just for them not having enough food to eat, for example, or you know, down in these arid countries for where was the arid place? What nation is that? Oh. Where were we looking before where we saw that Arab spot? There we go. So that arid attrition, we get 1% of attrition. So that means if we're, I think it means if we're there when the month ticks over, and I'm not certain on that. That's how I treat it. It may be if we're there longer than a month, as opposed to a month tick. I'm not certain. Regardless, walking through there would take that where it said that +1. That would be +1%. That means 130 dudes die. That doesn't sound like much, but when you're marching around a huge army, 13 is a tiny little army. When you're marching 37,000 troops through there and getting your where were we? Through there and getting your 11 of them are supplied, that's awful maths. That's 20. That is 26 of those troops aren't getting enough supplies. 26 time 1% of 26,000 troops is 260. So 260 dudes will die on the spot. Were they to be over there, it would be worse still. They would get that troop supply of 10 plus that negus of -1. They would get that would be 2%. They would get. It's all very confusing. We'll examine it when we see it happening to one of our units, so we can look at it properly. But I think there's another part of the puzzle that I'm missing. That if you go over the supply limit, you get a -5%. It gets vicious. Attrition in big prolonged wars will regularly cost you more manpower than the actual battles do, depending on where they are. Who's that? Oh, Ottomans are taking Albania already. Bad luck, Albania. Actually, that's right. This guy is amazing. But the problem is, Albania lasts for about 3 turns, and then 3 months, and then the Ottomans eat them every time. Bummer. But yes, that's an amazing general, an amazing leader. So, where were we? We were talking about military. What else have we got? We've got combat width, we discussed. Siege ability, we discussed. No, we didn't. So we won't talk about sieging until I can show you it. It's a tricky concept to explain. Forts active we know about, ships we don't care about. In this screen we can, you know, before we went in here and we turned off the fort individually, we set that we mothballed the fort individually. In here we can mothball all the forts and instantly save ourselves a whole bunch of money. Not something I'm going to do. Something I did a lot when I first started the game because I couldn't understand the economics of how the game played out. Now I don't think I've used that button since then, but it's kind of handy if there's occasions where you might want to avoid a loan, or like going bankrupt going into negative money at the end of a month, which would mean you would have to take out a loan and then pay the interest on it. Things like that, maybe I'd use it, but I don't think I have in a long time. And then activate all forts once they're once you're back in the black. Automatically raise maintenance during war is a pretty good idea, but you may not necessarily want to do it. If you've got a massive sprawling empire where you've turned off 50 forts, you may not want to be paying an extra $25 a month to keep them all running just because some idiot declared war on you. You may rather just keep the perimeter forts on, and that's a completely valid thing to do and a pretty sensible thing to do. There's no reason to spend money when you don't need to, because there is always more options to spend money on. So last things we'll talk about in here are siege pips, the various pips of our generals. We can see that we've got a leader limit of 2. That doesn't include when you make monarch, the monarch or the heir military leader. So we could get 2 more leaders. If we made 3 leaders, we would, in the same way as we're losing 1 point per month for an extra diplo relation, we'd lose one military point per month for each extra leader that we have. There we go, our base value is 1, and our feudalism, because we've got feudalism, we have 1 as well. But we can also use our monarch, and when his heir comes of age, only adults of 15 years or older can command armies. We can click him and have him become a general as well. But as you can see, having your heir leading an army could be beneficial, but it could also be a large risk, as generals have risk of dying on the battlefield. It doesn't cost any military power and maintenance, but it does increase the chances that he'll die. So I wouldn't ordinarily have made this guy a general, but you can't unmake a general. A monarch who leads an army in combat is far more likely to die, and it causes real trouble. But we'll see what happens. It's too late for us. Who knows? 1 second. Far out. Okay, so it's too late for us to do anything about that. He's already a general, but that's cool. We could raise another general if we wanted to. I would be very tempted to do that if we ended up in a war in the short term, because I don't want to risk him. Other options we've got are raising an admiral. He increases your the pips for your ships when they're fighting. I sometimes do it. Quest for the New World. Actually, no. Well, we'll talk about Navy if I ever build one. Quest for the New World and Conquistador. So I need Conquistador or an Explorer. When you do Quest for the New World National Idea, you can first recruit explorers who you then put on a heavy ship or a series or a couple of heavy ships, I can't remember, and he can then go exploring and go see what is out there in the world. Is that anyone's? No, it's not seen by anyone yet. Okay, so someone's done some exploring, and well, not actual exploring. We happen to know that there's some islands out here, but that's the extent of our knowledge of the west of Europe. What we would do, yes, we'd send the explorer out, and then eventually we could send a conquistador to do exploring on the land. The sea explorer explores the sea, the explorer explores the sea, the conquistador explores the land. That won't happen for a long time. Let's discuss pips and wrap this one up. So the pips that we see here that a general has are added to the unit's own pips when discuss... No, is that right? No, they're not added to the... they're not added to the unit's pips. They're added to the die roll that happens to randomize the combat outcome for the particular phase. Having your leader have good shock and good fire gives you massive bonuses to there we go. We can. I didn't realize this actually had a pop-up. So the fire value of the unit, yada 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 yada. Yeah. So it defends of the offensive fire value of the attacking unit and the defensive fire value of the defending unit. It'll be easier to explain during the battle. Same will apply for shock, no doubt, but maneuver is slightly different. Maneuver allows you to... The most important thing that I use maneuver for is for the movement speed. It's super useful, but I thought it... oh, lowers attrition, that's a good point. And makes the leader more likely to fight in favourable terrain. Okay, so my understanding of this has changed recently. My understanding was that that having a high maneuver aided you in battle, and that's when you're fighting when you're attacking an enemy in a place that gives the defender a bonus. Like when an enemy is defending some woods, you'll get a -1 negus to your dice roll. But my understanding had been until recently that if your leader had higher maneuver than the defending leader, that the difference between their maneuver scores would reduce the terrain bonus that the defender gets by 1. That's what that write-up there looks like it says to me, in saying that it makes the leader more likely to fight in favourable terrain, but I don't believe that's the truth. I've seen too many situations where that didn't pan out, where I thought my maneuver was going to help me avoid a massive negus and it didn't, and we took far more damage than we needed to. We'll investigate that when it comes to battle. It'll be interesting to examine it properly. The last thing we'll talk about on here, actually the last thing will be kicking out your generals, but we'll do that later. You can't kick out a king. Siege is the second to last thing. So siege value is super useful. When you are when you are sieging a fort, each fort level reduces the amount of likelihood that the siege will be effective by 1. You know what? Let's talk about that when it comes to when we actually do some sieging. It'll make much more sense and be much simpler to show you. So that'll wrap us up for this video. Thank you for sticking around and for having a look. Yeah, we'll discuss naval later. We'll discuss sieging later. But that's the basics of the military tab, and we are not too far now from actually pressing unpause on the game. Well, at least I already unpaused. I've seen other people not touch it for hours. We've done it to check out some trade and some diplomacy. Be back soon with the next one when we will discuss we'll discuss subjects and maybe round out this whole tab. Back soon.